So, what had happened to the man who kept us out of war? Quote, this is Wilson speaking to Congress 2 months after his re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." "The right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried near our hearts, for our democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself free at last." Close your eyes, and in that verbal trumpet blast, you can hear at least a faint echo of George W. Bush's missionary proclamation of freedom as a universal birthright and America as a divinely inspired agent of liberation. Wilson still matters. Wilson still speaks to us. Wilson still speaks through us, for better and worse. But there are cautionary notes in this music. Wilson raised public expectations with his eloquence, even as he roused his countrymen to forsake their traditional isolation and rescue the old world from itself. That is another way in which the Wilson experience is relevant to our own time. Wilson's first term had been marked by a concerted assault on economic monopoly. Wartime, well, there's a whole new agenda. And ironically, the man who invented the new freedom presides over the greatest centralization of power in the history of this nation, with himself practicing virtual one-man rule. He and his allies in Congress created a host of economic planning agencies to fix prices, establish priorities, allocate materials. There was an emergency fleet corporation, a fuel administration, even a national screw thread commission. Food will win the war, the voluntary campaign for Americans to go without wheat and meat so that there'd be more food for the Allies. The White House led by public relations gesture. This man who'd said he didn't much care for public relations. They junked the White House automobile, and the Wilsons rode around Washington in a horse-drawn carriage. Because of the laboring shortage, they got rid of the gardeners at the White House and replaced them with a flock of sheep. In fact, one wag started referring to the First Lady as Little Bo Peep. The problem with the sheep was they ate the shrubbery and the flowers, and in the end they turned out to be more expensive than the gardeners. The president's own son-in-law ran the nation's railroads, consolidating them into a single system. There was something called the Trading with the Enemy Act, which enabled Wilson to seize and administer all enemy property in the United States. 4 million workers were placed in war-related jobs. Another 2 million were shipped overseas, courtesy of the Selective Service Act. Thanks to the war, government engaged in behavior modification on an undreamed-of scale. First, the Army prohibited intoxicating drink from areas adjoining hastily constructed training camps. Then a grain shortage led Congress to outlaw the use of crops in distilling alcohol. If the red-faced patrons of Teutonic beer halls protested the sudden austerity, so much better. Cincinnati went a step further, banning the consumption of German pretzels at the lunch hour. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. In Iowa, the legislature passed a law making it a crime to speak on the telephone in any language but English. Daylight savings time was created by the Wilson administration. It's still with us. One White House chef, told to have dinner ready at 7 o'clock, asserted irritably, by whose time? Wilson's time or Christ's time? It was said everyone in the room laughed. Even the president cracked a smile until he said that is irreverent. Wilson tragically justified his own prophecy. This is Wilson's own prediction about what would happen if the United States went into war. Once lead this nation into war, and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. The spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into every fiber of our life. Before the end of 1917, Wilson jailed a socialist candidate for president, a man named Eugene Debs. He deported an anarchist named Emma Goldman. for verbally impeding the draft. Hundreds of others were prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or hounded by jingoes who smashed Beethoven records and banned German courses from the campus. Wilson, in the end, was an orator intoxicated by his own eloquence. But words have their limits. Sometimes people call me an idealist, he said. Well, that is the way I know I'm an American. America is the only idealistic nation in the world. The Versailles Peace Conference at the end of the war exposed the limits of his glittering phrases and his idealism. Pitted against cynics like George Clemenceau of France and Lloyd George of Britain, America's sermonizing president didn't stand a chance. The 14 points were wildly impractical, said the French leader. God himself was content with 10 commandments. Wilson clung to his hopes and his ideals long after he destroyed his health, and in a supreme irony, his own country's chances to enter the League of Nations, by which he had justified our entry into the war. He came back from Versailles. He realized that the Senate was not going to adopt the treaty, that the United States would not go into the League. So he decided to do what came naturally. He decided to go over the heads of the Senate, to get on a train, to go all over the country for several weeks and make speech after speech after speech. This, of course, is pre-radio, pre-television. Nothing like this had ever been done before. Wilson would single-handedly convince the American people that if the war was to have any purpose, any meaning at all, it would have to be in a League of Nations to prevent future war. Well, he destroyed his health in doing it. On the way back to Washington, he suffered a stroke. It was the end of the tour. He came back, and then 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, suffered a crippling stroke. It affected not only his health, doctors now believe it affected his mind in ways that made him absolutely unwilling to even entertain the possibility of compromise. The United States could have entered the League of Nations. They could have entered a league very close to the one that Wilson had negotiated. In the end, it was Wilson himself who was absolutely unwilling to compromise, not once but twice. And as a result, he was swept out of office in 1920. It became a referendum on the League and on what was called Wilsonism. There was a landslide in favor of a Republican from Ohio named Warren Harding. Now, Wilson, at his last meeting of his cabinet, said that he was going to teach ex-presidents how to behave. At the same time, he also said that he was going to have real problems with Mr. Harding's English. Remember, the former professor, someone once asked him to describe Harding's mind. He said, Warren Harding has a bungalow mind. Someone said, what does that mean? He said, no upper story. He did not leave Washington. He and Edith retreated to a house in the Kalorama neighborhood of the nation's capital, and there he became forgotten, or at least he thought, until something quite extraordinary happened at the very end of his life. On Armistice Day 1923, he made a brief radio speech, the only time he spoke on the radio. And the next morning, to his astonishment, he looked out on the street and there were 20,000 people, many of them kneeling reverently before this man who was seen as the great pilgrim of peace, the great wartime leader who justified war to end war, to make the world, in fact, safe for democracy. He had a walking stick. He called it his third leg, and he hobbled out to the front porch of the house, and everyone felt quiet. He spoke a few words, commonplace words, about his pride in the young men whom he had commanded as commander-in-chief. And then he said, I can't go on. And he turned around, and he began to go back into the house, and then a band in the street began playing the old Protestant hymn, How Firm a Foundation. And it's as if someone had flipped a switch. And Wilson said, stop the music, I have something else to say. And he hobbled back to the front of the house, and then in a voice that people had not heard in 3 years, a voice that was firm and clear and absolutely convinced of its own righteousness, he told the 20,000 people I have seen fools resist providence before, and I have seen their destruction. That we shall prevail is as sure as God reigns.